Welcome back to case study video number 14, Creative Vision Part 2. This is where we left the file at the end of the last video, and as we can see there are the local adjustments that we were talking about, the all adjustments. I have actually done a tiny little bit of work while I was off air just to remove a couple of sets of spots. Literally there's one up here, and there's a couple of others. Just a couple of little marks, and the way I tend to do things is just open at the very top, open a new layer, create a new layer, and with just the spot healing brush, it's usually perfectly adequate. With content aware and sample all layers highlighted, you can just go through and click all those little sensor spots, which are unfortunately ubiquitous in contemporary landscape photography, and that just removes them. And if we zoom in at the top there and turn this layer on and off, we can see this spot is the primary culprit, and that's the one that's disappeared. So that's pretty much all I've done while you have been away. And what I want to do now is look at something that's pretty much cutting edge. It's probably the one thing that more people are talking about in contemporary landscape photography than anything else, and that is the use of luminosity masks. These were I'm not going to say they were invented by, but they were certainly revolutionized by a chap called Tony Kuiper, who lives out in the western parts of the United States. And he's developed a number of actions which allow you to create very accurate masks that zone in on specific tones of the image. Now, in this image, we have made the image quite dark, and we can see here from the histogram that it's very much a shadows and mid-tones image with very little in the way of highlights. The only bright areas in the frame are here on the horizon and here in these clouds. And what we're failing to do is give these clouds the shape that perhaps they deserve, because shadows and highlights, one of the main things they do is shape subjects. And we can see in here there's an awful lot of detail in this sky. I mean, there's billowing clouds and it was blowing across the scene, and there's lots of different tonalities, and it was near sunset, so it's quite a blue shadowy scene. And what I want to try and do is to create a lot more meaning in these clouds. Now, this is not a definitive video on how to use Tony Kuiper's actions, but I will demonstrate what we're going to do with them. This is part of the actions, and they are opened by the Actions palette in Photoshop. And what I'm going to do is do what's known as a Tony Kuiper's Lights triple play. And I'm going to use it with curves adjustment layers. I'm not going to go into too much emphasis here about what all this blur business does, but needless to say, or suffice to say, a 30 pixel blur is going to create a little bit more definition in these clouds than if we used less blur or no blur, and the more blur you use, actually the more definition you get. So let's use a 30 pixel blur and click go. And what that does is set the action set in place, and you can see what's happening is it's creating 5 masks in a multiply blending mode and 5 masks in a screen blending mode. We know that multiplying blending mode darkens things, and the screen blending mode lightens things. And what we will do is, if you look at, you can then turn on and off each of these layers. If we use the multiply mode on the expanded layer, that is darkening not just the lights of this image, but some of the midtones as well. So we've darkened the tones, which is kind of the reverse of what we want to achieve, because we're wanting to add definition to them. So the second part of this is to brighten them again. And what we've done now is we've darkened the expanded highlights, added blur to them, and then brightened them again. And if we turn this layer on and off, you can very quickly see how much pop has been added to them without really changing the overall luminosity of the top of the image. It has also done something to the bottom of the image by adding micro contrast to the scene. But in this case, it's predominantly the effect they're having on the sky that I'm more bothered about. You can actually screen or multiply as many of these layers as you like. I mean, if you selected everything and then, I mean, you end up with this really faux HDR look that some photographers make a living out of doing. What I am going to do here is just darken one layer, brighten another one, and possibly think about, yeah, there we go. I think I'm going to brighten that layer as well, but I'm going to dial the opacity back to, say, about 70%. So I'm only a little over half brightening that particular layer again. And if we look at the overall effect, we've created monumental amounts of contrast in those clouds and a little bit in the foreground as well, without really doing very much at all. And if we turn this layer on and off with the big image, we've now got something that's got loads of micro contrast, an awful lot more mood in the sky, and the sky is now definitely starting to feel as ominous as it did when I was out on that beach with my wife a couple of weeks ago. So that is, we're very much getting to a stage where tonally, because what I tend to do is, first of all, is look at contrast, and finally I will start to look at color. If we feel it needs a little bit of a touch, there's a couple of things we can do. Tony also has masks for vibrance and saturation. Vibrance, as we know, tends to target more subtle tones. So if we look at the properties of that mask that we've just created, we can then increase the saturation only by a touch, and it's really zoning in on those warmer colors, not affecting the blues so much. It's definitely adjusting those warmer tones an awful lot more than the blues. Simple things like that, just to create a little bit more punch without going too far. This beach was incredibly red. I mean, when we arrived at it, we couldn't believe how bright it was and how saturated it was, because the sand is made from sandstone, Torridon sandstone. So, I mean, it really was quite dramatic stuff. If we pull these two layers down into our All Adjustments selection, which we can now see, we've gone from 0 here with very little processing through a number of local contrast and micro contrast and saturation phases to get to a stage where, we've created an image that's got fairly significant punch. As I said in the previous video, we can work this image any way we want. It just so happens that for this file, it was a cold, damp, moody, windy afternoon, which, I think this representation of it, this just looks insipid. Personally, I just feel it's very washed out. It's lacking contrast. It doesn't capture the mood or the gloominess or the energy that I was feeling when I was there, whereas this visually is much more stimulating. We have to remember that our viewers of our images don't have the benefit of memory. They weren't there. They didn't hear the gulls overhead. They didn't feel the wind on their faces. They didn't have the fatigue of having walked many miles to get to this location. They didn't have the prospect of walking back out again. They are looking at this image as a standalone two-dimensional representation of some reality, and it's up to us to try and instill in this image some of the emotion and the mood that we felt at the time, whilst remaining fairly true to the reality of the place also. We haven't altered things by removing objects or adding objects. We haven't altered the physical appearance of the scene. All we're doing is altering the mood and emotion of the image in an attempt to try and give our viewers a guiding hand, a little bit of a help for them to be able to experience something of what we experienced. So for now, I think we'll call that a day, and that is the end of case study number 14 and pretty much the end of the creative vision part of the course, and we wish you well.